Joining me now, my friend Andy McCarthy, who everyone knows, best-selling author. The Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency is a must-read, particularly very helpful, especially if you watched all of the Rosenstein stuff, the hearings from yesterday, or the day before, rather. And also, Andy was former chief assistant U.S. attorney, and he knows a thing or two about prosecuting terrorists, and he joins us on the phone now. Andy, always a pleasure. Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday, Dana. Good to talk to you.
Good to be with you. So there's so many things that your expertise can actually be applied to with all of the topics right now. I mean, I have a couple of questions for you as it relates to Rosenstein as well. But with the subject of Antifa and William Barr classifying this as domestic terror, I know that they're starting to now look at their associations. This, to me, when I look at this with the 30,000-foot view without the legal expertise or knowledge of how this is done, to me this seems almost one of the most impossible things to do, because it seems so decentralized purposefully. What is the DOJ doing? What is even the protocol for trying to run something down like this and investigate this as a way to keep Americans safe from the potential damages we've been seeing in the streets of late?
Well, Dana, there's a history here. And Antifa, you know, if you read a lot of the coverage in the last few weeks where they talk about, you know, loose organization and it doesn't have the regiment or the hierarchy of the military and all that stuff, you would think that something like that was required to investigate terrorism when, you know, if you go back to the late 60s and the 1970s when the joint terrorism task forces in New York first, but later throughout the United States, when they first started to form up, we had a wave of domestic terrorism that went on for about a dozen years in the United States. And those organizations didn't have the regiment of the military either. You know, it's not that it's much more of an issue that you make a decision that you're going to regard something as terrorist activity and investigate it as such than to have like these formal designations and classifications
right.
and the like. Like when I prosecuted terrorists in the early 90s, we didn't have a designation process at that point. And it didn't matter a whit because, you know, there were plenty of laws. There's laws at the state level. There's laws at the federal level.
Right.
We prosecuted our terrorists under a Civil War era statute that makes it a crime to conspire to levy war against the United States. It was a perfect fit. Happily, there's not that many groups that do that kind of thing.
Thankfully.
But it was, you know, right. But it was a perfect fit for our evidence, and it's
right.
a perfect fit for a lot of what's going on now. So there's lots of laws. What you need is what Barr, I think, is imposing, which is the kind of discipline and direction that this is how we're going to handle this problem. I think that's much more important.
Yeah, that's a very good point with that. And speaking of how to handle the problem, the big item of debate this week has been related to what the president has proposed, and it's even gotten a Tom Cotton editorial dropped. Well, or at least they're not going to, I don't think, publish any more conservative pieces in the New York Times editorial pages after Tom Cotton's editorial on this. So the president was talking about maybe possibly sending in the military if states and localities could not get the violent riots, which are totally separate from peaceful protests, under control. He had said at one point that he put military on 4 hours notice, and then there was all kinds of discussion as to whether or not he even could invoke the Insurrection Act, what that would look like. Everyone was worried about an overly militarized police. Give us your thoughts on the legal aspects of that, because I know that there's a precedent for it. And I know that there are certain times when the federal government has to act to restore law and order. They're very rare times, you know, for instance, 1992 with the riots. But there is, you know, I get it that people have a genuine fear of being able to walk back an encroachment once it has been made. So what is because everybody really respects your thoughts on this, how do you approach this, and what was your take on the president's remarks on this?
I think that there's so much legal and historical ignorance about this, and a lot of it, Dana, is not really ignorance. A lot of the people who are talking about this know that what they're saying is nonsense. The Insurrection Act goes back to 1807. It actually has precursors that go back to 1792. A lot of this is drawn out of Article 4 of the Constitution, which that doesn't make this like a matter of discretion. The federal government has the obligation to protect the states under certain circumstances when they're facing, invasion, when there's a breakdown in law and order, when there's domestic violence. The Insurrection Act is a number of provisions in federal law that enable the president to do that. Some of them require state sign off. That is, you have to have a request from the state before the authorities or the federal authorities can send armed forces in. But a lot of the provisions allow the president to act unilaterally. And in fact, I found it particularly ironic that what people were contending is that you can't do it, that a president can't do it without state sign off. And under the circumstances that Trump wants to do it, it smacks of racism. When the history of the Insurrection Act is the federal authorities sending in state troops often to combat the forces of racism, whether they were forces that the state couldn't control, like the Ku Klux Klan after the 1871 Civil Rights Act, or in the years after Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, when we tried to desegregate
like Little Rock
areas of the South. Yeah, Eisenhower and Kennedy, they sent troops in to enforce desegregation and civil rights. So, the thought that can't be done is ridiculous. And also the thought that if you send in federal troops, you are, I couldn't believe General Mattis saying this, that you're militarizing and turning the country into a battle space. I have great respect for Mattis, but, sir, I have news for you. Open your eyes. The country is a battle space, and the idea here is law enforcement cannot impose order when order has been lost. We've been fortunate for 30 years to live in an era of unbelievable domestic tranquility. People don't remember what it was like in the 60s and 70s and 80s when we had crime waves and terrorism and all that stuff. We've actually lived in an unprecedentedly peaceful time where we've had plunging crime rates, especially violent crime. And people, I think, have forgotten that if you don't do the things that brought that about, you can lose that in a hurry. And once you lose order, the police don't have the resources to restore order, which is why you have to call in the military from time to time. But it doesn't turn them into the police.
Right.
It allows them to protect Americans and restore order so we can get back to domestic law enforcement. And that's all anyone's talking about here.
Yeah, it's amazing to see the reaction to this. And I noted earlier, and I know you've discussed this as well, this purposeful conflation of peaceful protest with violent riots as a way to sort of wrap the violence in the veneer of peaceful protest so that people don't have to condemn it because it's inconvenient for them to sort of admit that, well, yes, these are really kind of driven by Antifa, which is a very far left militant organization. They don't have to condemn it in that regard. You have a great piece, Laws Against Rioting and Terrorism Must Be Enforced Against Antifa and Other Violent Radicals. I am amazed that people think that somehow you are infringing on speech by telling, say, a group of rowdy rioters, stop maybe throwing bricks at cops and bottles and Molotov cocktails, maybe move back a little bit. That's not an infringement on any right.
Well, no, of course it's not. But, the other thing, Dana, that bothers me about this, and I know we're not supposed to say this, but, at a certain point in time, don't the actual peaceful protesters have to step up and take some responsibility here? I mean, if I was exercising my lawful constitutional rights and I thought that by doing that, I was lending cover to people who wanted to make war on my country, I would stop. Because it would be more important to me to make sure that I wasn't being used that way than to say whatever it is I thought I needed to say. And also, I would point out that there are other ways to protest, and there are other ways to register your dissent other than standing side by side with anarchists and anti-American terrorists on the street and providing cover for them so that it becomes hard for people to sort out, who were the peaceful protesters and who were the terrorists. I really think, people have to take some agency here. And if you're a peaceful protester and you're allowing your peaceful protest to be hijacked by terrorists to the point where they're using you to facilitate the violence that they're doing to other people, maybe you ought to be rethinking how you're protesting.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. Last quick question for you. I had to get your thoughts on the Senate hearing with Rosenstein, and I was amazed when he was asked by Senator Graham, knowing what you know now, would you still have signed this FISA application? And he says, no, I would not have. And I was a little shocked that there wasn't a follow up to that, where they said, okay, so what actually did you think verified the application that you signed? Because you said that you had to have verified it. To you, it was verified at the time. What convinced you? Nobody asked that question, at least that I saw in the audio that we got and the notes we had. Your thoughts on this?
Oh, I just found my head was exploding throughout the hearing. And, my objection to Graham's question, if you knew then what you know now, the implication of that question is that he knows something now.
Yes.
I love Kim Strassel has a great piece in the Wall Street Journal about, how they hid this, that, and the other thing from Rod. And I agree with everything she said, but she also points out, and I think this is the bigger problem, it's really not that hard to hide stuff from somebody who doesn't want to know anything. And we were dealing with a guy at the top of all this who didn't want to know anything. And I say this, Dana, we laugh because otherwise I have to start punching walls and stuff. But,
right.
When I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, both as a boss and somebody who worked for people like Rudy Giuliani for a number of years, I fielded more than my share of 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls asking, what about this, what about that, before we were about to do something in a big case, because I dealt with people in the chain of command who wanted to know what was going on and who understood that if we were going to do big enforcement actions or big intelligence collection actions, it was important that we had the whole thing buttoned up and we were acting legitimately. So I lay that out because every single FISA submission that the FBI made in connection with Carter Page contained a paragraph, which was in the middle of a bunch of other intriguing paragraphs, that said the FBI believes that members of the Trump campaign are in a conspiracy of cooperation with the Kremlin to commit cyber espionage operations against the United States. Now, I know he said that there's a lot of investigations that a deputy attorney general has to supervise, but I think that's pretty important that the not only potential, but by the time Rosenstein got the case, the guy who's been president for 7 months, we're going into the FISA court and telling them under oath that the president and his associates may be in a conspiracy of cooperation with the Kremlin. And he doesn't want to know about it? I mean, what does he want to, what do you want to know about if you don't want to know about that? So
precisely.
This is so far from my experience, I can't even wrap my brain around it.
We all feel your total frustration with it. It's at level comical now. That's even past just, infuriated. Andy McCarthy, always such a pleasure. Ball of Collusion, the plot to rig an election and destroy presidency. If you all have not gotten it, make sure you go and do so. Andy, have a great weekend. Thank you, my friend.